according to Mark. As Jesus was going out from the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Rabbi, behold what marvelous stones and wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be thrown down." As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew were questioning him privately. "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "See to it that no one misleads you. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and will mislead many. When you hear of wars and rumors of war, do not be terrified. Those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will also be famines. These things are merely the beginnings of birth pangs. But be on your guard, for they will deliver you to the courts, and you will be flogged in public places. And you will stand before governors and kings for my sake, as a witness to them. For the gospel must first be preached to all the nations. And when they arrest you and hand you over, do not worry beforehand about what you are to say, but say whatever is given to you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but it is the Holy Spirit. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child, and children will rise up against parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but the one who endures to the end, he will be delivered. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one who is on the housetop must not go down or go in to get anything out of his house. And the one who is in that field must not turn back to get his coat. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. Pray that it may not happen in the winter, for in those days there will be a time of tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of creation until now, and ever will be. Unless the Lord has shortened these days, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect whom God chose, these terrible days will be shortened. And then if anyone says to you, "Behold, here is the Christ," or "Behold, he is there," do not believe them. For false messiahs and false prophets will arise, and will even show signs and wonders in order to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. But take heed, behold, I have told you everything in advance. Then in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not reflect its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers that are in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send forth the angels and will gather together God's chosen ones from the four winds, from the farthest end of the earth to the farthest end of heaven. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer draws near. Even so, you too, when you see these things happening, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. But of that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. So pay attention, keep on the alert, for you do not know when the appointed time will come. It is like a man away on a journey, who upon leaving his house and putting his slaves in charge, assigning to each his task, also commanded the doorkeeper to stay on the alert. Therefore, be on the alert, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, whether in the evening, at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, in case he should come suddenly and find you asleep. What I say to you, I say to all. Be on the alert. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise you, Lord Jesus. You may be seated. One of the things that is a continual source of joy for me when we gather on Sunday morning is when we are here together and I see you here. I know you're here because you really want to be here. No one is here because they feel obliged to be here. Like if you miss a Sunday at St. Andrew's, you would have to doubt whether you'll be saved or not, you know. That if something should happen, God forbid, you might end up in the place you don't intend to end up in. You're here because you want to be here, and that is a blessing to me. Because there's something that is drawing you within your heart to be here. And I suspect that it is that deep yearning that is found in every human heart when we take the time to examine our hearts. A yearning for God in our lives. A yearning for a deep sense of connection with the one who's responsible for bringing us into existence to begin with. We are here for many reasons. We come with many burdens on our hearts. We come to pray for those in need. We come to pray for ourselves because maybe we're in a time in our life in which we are in the midst of crisis or deep difficulty or a sense of profound loss. We come here motivated by the gift of faith so that we might fully realize the meaning of our lives. And this is why we are here. And your presence here is evidence of the faith that is within your heart, of the hidden work of God, because God is always at work in a hidden way within every human heart. Today we celebrate one of the last Sundays. We have one more Sunday left, that's next week, of the liturgical year. We have come to the end of a cycle. And it is very typical every year at this time that when we listen carefully to the gospel and the readings that are being proclaimed, that once again the church is reminded that we live in the last days. And I believe this is true, that we live in the last days. Does this mean that I believe that Jesus Christ is coming again tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock? No, it doesn't. It could be 10,000 years from now, but irregardless, there was something of such great importance, such a decisive event in the history of humanity that took place 2,000 years ago in what we call the incarnation of God in the person of Jesus Christ, that from that point on, history is rapidly moving to its conclusion. How we would measure that time, we will never know. Jesus says no one knows the day or the hour. And so I would always be suspect of anyone, whether they're a preacher on the radio or the television or a popular religious teacher that you find in another venue, if they're telling you that this is it, the second coming is happening within the next few years, I remind you that this has been believed periodically throughout the history of the church. It kind of goes through cycles. I remember living through such a cycle in the history of the church. Well, you were all alive then, most of you. Back in the late 60s and early 70s. And in that time, there was a great feeling in the air that was, for lack of a better word, it was an apocalyptic feeling. That perhaps the end is near. We were so pessimistic as a generation at that time. We were engaged in a war in Southeast Asia that we thought we would never end. And many of us lost friends in that war. The economy wasn't good, and our political institutions were strained with corruption. You remember those days. And it was a difficult time to be alive. And so there was great religious fervor that broke forth, particularly in members of my generation. And the best-selling books at that time were books that talked about the approaching end of the world. I remember a very popular bestseller on the New York bestseller list in 1971 called The Late Great Planet Earth, written by Hal Lindsey, in which he outlined exactly how the end of the world was going to happen, and if he wouldn't call a date, we were pretty sure that he was suggesting it would happen in 1975. And so in 1975, many of us were waiting for the end of the world, and 1975 became 1976. This happens periodically within the history of humanity and in the history of the church. We simply do not know when the day or hour of the end of human history as we know it will come. But the fact of the matter is, we are called by the words of Jesus in this gospel to pay attention and to live each day of our lives as if it were the last. And if you had somehow had the foreknowledge this was the last day that you were going to spend on this planet, I'm quite certain that you would make different kinds of decisions. Things would have a lot more gravitas in what you would do and who you would spend your time with. This is something that Jesus gives to us in this gospel today as a warning that we might be prepared and remember that we are but mortal. And that our lives are entirely too brief. And life itself is a very fragile thing. And we never know the day or the moment in which we will be called home, when we will breathe our last. This could be the last week of your life. No one knows. So we should live as though we are living in the last days. Paying attention and doing those things that count the most. And not wasting our time with things that pass away and are only things that are mildly entertaining for us in the moment, but we miss the real gift and the most important things of life. This is the message of today's gospel. Jesus is sitting on the summit of the Mount of Olives, which is a mountain that sits just east of the great and holy city of Jerusalem. And he's there, and it's the last week of his life. His disciples don't know this fact. Jesus is fully aware of it. And as they were sitting there in the sunset and looking across this grand view of the Temple Mount, Mount Zion, and the beautiful edifice that was built there, which took a generation to build, and they were looking at and admiring the massive stonework that was in place there, the disciples, even though they had been there for 3 times a year, every year of their lives, because they were faithful Jews that went on pilgrimage feasts there, they were still in awe of the magnificence of this great and holy city of Jerusalem. It was built to last forever. And as they were admiring these great buildings of Jerusalem, this great city, as they were sitting there on the mountain east of the city and taking in this grand view of the holy city of Jerusalem, Jesus then begins to utter forth a prophetic oracle that was rather pessimistic, it would seem. It was a prophetic message saying, I tell you that one stone will not stand upon another. That everything you're seeing here will be utterly and completely destroyed. And sure enough, exactly 40 years to the year after Jesus made those remarks on the Mount of Olives considering Jerusalem, the Romans were laying siege to that rebellious city, and finally, after 3 years of laying siege to the city, they broke through the gates of Jerusalem, and they slaughtered every man, woman, and child, no matter how old they were or how young they were, whether they were unarmed or armed. They slaughtered everyone. The streets poured forth rivers of human blood, and the entire city was completely leveled and destroyed. And the magnificence of that temple, which stood as witness to a faith and tradition of an ancient people, was now utterly and completely destroyed. All that is left, even to this day, is the western wall of the outward foundations of the temple, which is now called the Wailing Wall. And you can go see that magnificent stonework there, but it's all in ruins. So the prophetic oracle of Jesus was indeed fulfilled. Jerusalem, the holy city, was destroyed. It was a tragic moment in the history of Israel and the history of the Jewish people. And they were forced to wander through the nations of the earth for the next 2,000 years, even into our own day. Even as we pick up the newspaper or tune in to Yahoo or the news, we see that even today, this part of the world is a world that is characterized by tension and by the threat of violence and total destruction and annihilation. Things don't ever seem to change. We go through the same patterns and cycles over and over again. A cycle of violence, a cycle of anxiety, a cycle of fear. But not only did the Jewish people leave us a great legacy, it wasn't the temple as they thought it would be. That was destroyed. They left us their religious reflections, their religious memories, their experience, their spirituality, and they left this as a great legacy for the rest of human civilization. And it's embodied in what we call the Hebrew Scriptures. We like to call them as the Old Testament. And in the pages of the Hebrew Scriptures, we find a common thread, a narrative that leads from the very beginning in the book of Genesis and winds its way through all these various types of literature and writings and poetry and wisdom teachings that were left behind. When we do a careful analysis of the Old Testament, which is a collection of various writings from various times in the history of Israel, based upon the different experiences they had historically, even though we can follow that narrative, sooner or later we encounter different other kinds of literature that is present there. The first kind of literature, as we follow the narrative of the ancient Scriptures, is the commandments and the instructions, the law, the Torah, which was given to the people of Israel according to their sacred tradition by Moses himself, the man of God. He gave them Torah. It was to teach them how to live. And they built an entire way of life and a civilization upon Torah. That is followed by, as the narrative goes on, by a second level, if you will. The foundation being Torah, the law. Then there was the prophetic writings, the Nevi'im, the ancient Hebrew prophets of Israel, uttered prophetic oracles against the injustice that existed in the society and civilization of ancient Israel. You see, the prophets were not about necessarily predicting the future. Most of their writings were written for their day, addressing issues of their day, and they were the conscience of Israel. They were concerned about justice being done for the poor. It was a serious warning to all those who were in positions of power and wealth. They directed their message against the 1% of their time, warning them if they didn't take into consideration the plight of the poor and of the suffering, that they will be headed for disaster. And so the writings of the prophets raised the consciousness of Israel out of merely being a culture of right and wrong and of laws and of legalism to a level of expanding their consciousness that being in God's will is more than just following rules. It's about having a concern for those who are less fortunate than myself. I have a responsibility not only to avoid doing bad things, but I have a responsibility to take care of and be good to others who are in need, to alleviate human suffering wherever I find it. This is the message of the ancient prophets. It was relevant then, it is relevant today in our own lives. And then after a careful reading of the narrative of the Hebrews, we follow the string into the later parts of the Hebrew Scriptures, which are called the writings. This is the wisdom tradition of Israel. Israel later in her history arrived at a higher level of human consciousness. They realized that God's will is not only something that has to do about avoiding bad things and doing good things, about being concerned about those who are less fortunate than myself, but that the life that I'm to live in the presence of God with my brothers and sisters is one that should be characterized by love and wisdom. With the coming of Jesus, after 1,500 years of this literary tradition, Jesus fulfills the law of Moses. Jesus is the fulfillment of Torah. In fact, Jesus says, Torah bears witness of me. Jesus not only is the fulfillment of Torah, but he's also the fulfillment of all the prophetic oracles uttered by the ancient Hebrew prophets. He is the fulfillment of the prophets. The prophets bear witness to him and his coming. And then the wisdom literature. Jesus becomes the fullness and the fulfillment of all the wisdom of this ancient civilization of Israel. He is the fulfillment of all of the law and of the prophets and of the wisdom teachers. And yet, in a careful reading of the ancient Hebrew Scriptures, we detect yet another kind of tradition. There is another literary tradition that sometimes is overlooked. And it comes in the latest part of the development of the Hebrew canon. It is called Apocolyptic spirituality. And it's a strange literary form. And especially to us who are living at the dawn of the 21st century, when we read apocalyptic literature, we find it to be rather bizarre and strange. It defies logic. It is a language that is difficult to understand. The writers use highly symbolic images that are hard to even imagine. They use cryptic language. It's obviously symbolic language, but what is the key to unlock the meaning of these strange texts? They're bizarre to read. One of the great writers in this tradition is called Daniel, who wrote very late in the period of the Old Testament. He might be the originator of this kind of literary tradition within Israel. When I read apocalyptic literature, that of Daniel, or in the New Testament, the book of the Apocalypse, I find it to be quite strange indeed. Very bizarre. It's like reading someone's bad nightmare. The images of the monsters, the images of the beasts and the creatures, the imagery of such vast amounts of human suffering, it reads like a horror story. Alfred Hitchcock, I think, could not write up anything scarier than John the Patmos wrote in the book of Revelation, or Daniel in the prophecy that bears his name. These are strange stories indeed. What is the meaning of such a strange tradition? Has anyone ever read that stuff? Yeah, there's a reason why you haven't read it. And you can't interpret it very easily either. It's difficult. It's just strange. It's like trying to interpret your dreams. You know, when you dream, you don't understand everything you're dreaming. It's like a story that unfolds in your head. And all kinds of bizarre things that happen that are inexplicable. And strange imagery. Strange images come to you. That's what it's like to read apocalyptic literature. Now, what does this word apocalypse mean? You've heard it in popular language. When we think of something apocalyptic, we're thinking of something like the Hurricane Sandy that struck the East Coast. That's when they start saying it was like an apocalypse. All this destruction on such a massive scale, it must be the end of the world. And for some people it was. The word apocalypse is a Greek word, and it simply means this, and this is how they would use the word. You're coming home and you smell something good on the stove. Your mother or your wife, oh, I don't want to be sexist, your father or your husband. I forget, I'm not in the first century, I'm in the 21st now. Something is smelling delicious, you're not quite sure what it is. And so you go over to the pot that's cooking on the stove, and there's a lid, and you can see the steam and the smoke coming up and carrying that wonderful aroma, and you wonder what it is, and you lift the lid, and a puff of smoke and steam comes out, and you look, and you see what it is. Apocalyptic moment right there. You lift the lid. Apocalyptic or apocalypse means simply, literally, to lift the lid. Or perhaps you're at a theater, getting ready for the show to start, and all of a sudden the curtain parts and the drama begins, and you're there as a spectator. That drawing the curtain back is a moment of apocalypse. It is a moment in which something that was hidden is now fully revealed to your view. Or like the story of the Wizard of Oz. You know, when Dorothy and the Lion, the Scarecrow, and the Tin Man were appearing before the great Oz. And all of a sudden, what did Toto do? Went up and pulled the curtain back, and there was the Wizard of Oz, someone pulling levers, and it was all fake. The lid was lifted. The curtain was drawn. All was revealed. That's what the word apocalypse means. Now, why at this time in history do the Jewish people create this literary form? What does it mean for us? Even Jesus on the Mount of Olives, when he is speaking to his disciples, becomes for us the Jewish apocalyptic seer. He becomes the prophet of the apocalypse. Even he participates in this cultural milieu of the Hebrew people. He participates in the religious imagination, and he begins to give this oracle, which is apocalyptic. The message of the apocalyptic seer or the apocalyptic prophet is simply this, my brothers and sisters. After you get through all that strange imagery and cryptic language, which seems so awful, the message becomes loud and clear. And here it is. No matter how bad it gets in your life, no matter what tragedies you are forced to endure, no matter what the profound loss and pain you have experienced in life, no matter how bad it will get, and it will get bad, it's going to be all right. It's going to be okay. I'm reminded of this with my own life. I look into the mirror, and it's no fun to look in the mirror the older I get. Have you had that experience? Because when I'm walking around doing my daily activities, in my head I have an image of myself, and I'm 21 years old. You know, I'm about 50 pounds lighter, much stronger, more hair, no gray. In fact, in my head, I want you to know what I look like. Andrew, my son. Stand up, everyone. That's how I look in my head. Then I walk in front of the mirror, and I have an apocalyptic moment. The curtain reveals what I really am, and I'm seeing that I'm aging, and already death is at work in me, and I realize I am terminal. We're all terminal. It's all going to end. And before it ends, we're going to suffer. It gets worse as we get older. We face disease, injury, financial hardship. I don't go up on the roof of my house anymore. I hire someone else to risk their lives. I slow down on the freeway. I'm going 55 miles per hour now with cruise control. Death is at work. And I realize I am mortal. I'm living in my last days. And I realize life is so brief. The message of the apocalyptic writer is, yes, and it's going to get worse. You think it's bad now? It's going to get worse. But it's okay. Because the worst, and death is the worst, won't have the final word. It's not the end. It only seems like your world is falling apart. But beyond the destruction of your life, when this life comes to its abrupt and sudden end, there is another life on the other side. There is a horizon, and on the horizon already we can see the glow of the light of a new day that is arriving and approaching. And we are called to participate in that. So look up. Behold, your salvation is near. Although this life is temporary and it passes away, there is a greater life that will never end. God has not abandoned Israel. God has not abandoned the human race. No matter how hard it becomes for you, God is with you. And God will have the final word. He will come in judgment. And that word judgment, when the apocalyptic writers use that, that sounds like a scary word, doesn't it? I used to think of the last judgment. Oh boy, am I worried about the last judgment. Like God is going to be there, and you're going to appear before Him, and He's going to have these scales, you know. And then it's Peter Hickman before Almighty God. God's holding these scales. And He's putting on one side all the good things I did, which now, at that moment, I realized wasn't nearly enough. And then all the bad things. A shopping cart of bad things. And the scale tips, and I'm going to that other place. Forever. Right? That's what we think of judgment. That's not what the Hebrews thought of, especially the apocalyptic writers. That's not what they think of when they say God is judge. To the ancient Hebrews, judge is not a man in a gown behind a desk rendering a legal opinion whether you're guilty or innocent. That's not what a judge is in the Hebrew mentality. A judge is one who brings justice. A judge is one who rights wrongs, who destroys evil, destroys death. Even death and evil is accountable to the judge of all the universe, and He will dispose of these things. And the last enemy to be destroyed is death itself. A judge in the mind of the apocalyptic prophet is one who saves and delivers from utter destruction and ushers in a new age without death. A new age of eternal life. A new age in which every being is ruled in their hearts by the perfect law of love. Can you imagine a world like that? That's the new world that is coming. That is what Jesus is announcing. And this old world is passing away. My life is passing right in front of my eyes. Because I know I live in the last days, if not in the last days of the human history, at least in my own last days. I live because I am mortal, but I also live knowing that I will live forevermore beyond the pale and beyond the reach of suffering and death. That is the message of the apocalyptic prophet. So do not worry, my brothers and sisters. Jesus says, in the world you have great tribulation, but cheer up. Take courage. I have overcome the world. And indeed He has. And we have a share in that victory. And that, my brothers and sisters, is the gospel of the Lord. Let us stand and profess our faith.